Good morning, everyone. Welcome to all our participants from across the Americas. Very good early morning on the North American Pacific coast, and a good afternoon in the UK and the EU. My name is Jeff Passmore, and I'm very happy to welcome you to the third in our series of 8 weekly Scaling Up Live webinars. This entire series of webinars is sponsored by our platinum sponsor, EcoStrat. As most of you know, North America's biomass supply chain experts. But you may not know that EcoStrat has sourced and supplied over 5 million tons of wood fiber and organic feedstock in markets across North America. Today's webinar is co-hosted by CAAFI, Commercial Aviation Alternative Fuels Initiative, and Advanced Biofuels Canada, a national industry association advocating on behalf of Canada's biofuel industry. Just a few housekeeping notes. If you're having any problems with the audio, please check your audio settings by clicking the audio button on Zoom. You might need to change your speaker settings. And if you have a Bluetooth device connected, we recommend turning it off. Turn off your Bluetooth while you're on Zoom. In the unlikely event we experience any major technical interference, a new Zoom link will be sent to you and a meeting will resume in 5 minutes. Also, as a registered participant, your video capabilities are disabled and you're automatically muted. The webinar is being recorded and will be available to all registrants following the end of today's session. Just a reminder to panelists who are not speaking, please mute your microphone until it's your time to present. And most importantly, as an audience member, if you have a question, please use the Q&A button. Type your question into the text box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Do not use the chat box, please. We will only be monitoring the Q&A box for questions. And if you need any technical assistance, you see there the email for Jake Schmershansky, who you can email if there's any issues that you need help with. Now then, speaking of our session hosts, Commercial Aviation Alternative Fuels Initiative and Advanced Biofuels Canada, it gives me great pleasure to introduce the chair for today's webinar, Steve Zonka, Executive Director of CAAFI. Steve, you've got a great panel. Over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. Good day, everyone, and welcome. We've got participants from around the globe, and I'm pleased you're able to join us for this discussion on the nexus of technology and policy related to sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF. Again, my name's Steve Zonka. I'm the Executive Director of CAAFI, the Commercial Aviation Alternative Fuels Initiative, and you've just been introduced to the other panel members. You can find out more information about these gentlemen and myself by going to the Speakers tab on the scalingupconference.ca website. I'd like to initiate today's discussion on sustainable aviation fuel with 4 foundational points, and we'll use these to frame a broader discussion today. The first one is that sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, and we'll use that acronym regularly through this discussion, is a fuel that's produced to the requirements of ASTM D7566, and it is jet fuel. It is not inferior in any way to the jet fuel produced by today's petroleum refineries. In some ways, SAF is actually superior or preferred from an OEM perspective. It can be used for all turbine-powered aviation, including commercial, business and general aviation, and military. We've been using it continuously since 2016, and thanks to producers like NESTE, World Energy, Gevo, and others, we've been increasing the volume produced and consumed every year. We have line of sight to significant expansion to over 1 billion gallons capacity by 2026, but that represents just 1% of the total worldwide jet fuel demand. So we have a ways to go. 2, our combined work for the last 15 years has all been foundational and accretive to the establishment of SAF as a key element for aviation to address our future sustainability. Today, SAF is more expensive than conventional jet. It just is. However, we are not at some point of stagnation with respect to SAF development, nor are today's fundamentals the same as they will be tomorrow. The future actually looks brighter. will continue to qualify new SAF production pathways. Today, we have 7 approved, 6 more in process, and there's at least another 15 in the pipeline. And the CAAFI R&D pre-screening process is very active at present, with collaborations with over 18 different production concepts. These efforts will continue to expand the applicability of SAF production from additional feedstock sources with a focus on targeted 24/7 types of low-value sustainable feedstock streams, and they are out there. Some of these processes will enable a fully drop-in SAF, foregoing the need to blend in the future. Not all, but some, and expanding the level of carbon reduction possible on a per-flight basis. Fuels in production today, as well as those being developed, will be able to achieve carbon index reductions greater than those recognized today, with many becoming carbon negative fuels. Think about that, pulling more carbon from the biosphere than is released during combustion in flight. So again, giving us a brighter future with respect to carbon reductions. SAF will be sustainable. The airlines are pursuing sustainable approaches, and I recognize the definition of sustainability will continue to change over time. But with the definitions that are out there today, we're pursuing fuels that are sustainable, and they deliver benefits beyond just net life cycle greenhouse gas reductions. These include significant reductions in tailpipe emissions, including oxides of sulfur, particulate matter, and carbon monoxide. They will also be significant rural development creators with jobs and economic activity resulting from the establishment of domestic production, as well as enhanced supply surety for the industry. Depending on the feedstock source, the supply chains can deliver reductions in landfilled or incinerated waste, as well as reductions in fugitive methane emissions, another greenhouse gas, and carbon dioxide. Fourth, finally, the primary challenge in achieving everything I just highlighted is achieving competitive cost with conventional jet fuel, including value elements driven by competing demands and related policies. Without SAF profitability, either directly or indirectly with the assistance of stable long-term policy and continued risk reduction, capital will unlikely flow to new SAF production facilities. And we'll have to continue to develop additional capacity on a unique case-by-case basis, as we have been doing this past decade. This is not the type of business development that's desired or warranted. We want ubiquitous development. So SAF is viable, valuable, and will continue to increase in value from a greenhouse gas perspective. And the industry suggests, as they did back during our original commitment in 2008, that we can only undertake this journey with appropriate government support, and that policy needs to be address to reflect these realities. Hence the reason for this targeted discussion this morning entitled, Can Policy Enable Navigation to Destination, where destination is deep carbon reduction for the entire aviation enterprise. So repeating those 4 elements. 1, SAF is real. 2, SAF's future potential looks brighter. 3, SAF delivers multiple benefits to society. And 4, the civil aviation industry hopes these attributes are addressed with appropriate policy, including research and development and risk reduction, that allow us to get on a great SAF growth trajectory. So that concludes my remarks. Let's dive a bit more into these observations with introductory comments from our panelists. Let's start with Brentan, because Brentan's focus at New Energy Risk is more on the nuts and bolts of lowering risk and lowering CapEx and opening this sector up to more institutional investment. Brentan, feel free to share some perspectives from your perspective and those of New Energy Risk with our audience.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, so New Energy Risk, as Steve mentioned, at New Energy Risk, we see SAF at this inflection point, moving from the R&D side to really getting into commercialization. And policy is obviously a very big and important component of that. And I'll let Alex and Fred speak to some of the policy details because they're much more intelligent on those aspects than I. But NER, we look at this space and we see policy is a necessary foundation to enable this commercialization. but it's not it's necessary but not sufficient, right? To enable this to happen, SAF projects have to become fully bankable. They have to be in the market in a way like utility solar is today, where they're standardized, you can turn the crank, institutional capital flows into them, and they're routinely financed. And to get there, that means all the various risks associated in a project have to be correctly mitigated. That's technology risk. It also means feedstock risk, offtake risk. So lots of components have to come together to enable these projects to actually reach market. And so new energy risk, what we do as an insurer is offer insurance solutions to help transfer some of these risks for early commercial, first commercial, second commercial projects out of the finance capital space and into the insurance space, so that the technology risk associated with projects gets mitigated, potential feedstock risk can look to get mitigated, maybe risk associated with tax recapture or things like that, so that these projects start to look more like a traditional project finance structure that institutional capital providers are going to come in and lend against or provide capital for, which is really what's going to be needed for these projects to reach scale and make the impact that I think we all know that they can. So I'm happy to be on this panel. I appreciate the time to talk a bit about what we see in the marketplace at NER. Excited to hear from Alex and Fred on the latest on the policy front, and hope to engage in a thought-provoking discussion here on the future of SAF.
Thanks, Brentan. So I'll again remind everybody, if you've got questions for the panelists, feel free to jot them down in the Q&A box and we'll get to them, as opposed to having me drive a bunch of questions from my perspective. Okay, let's jump over to Alex now. And Alex has a couple of slides to share with us that outline NESTE's views on this topic. Alex?
Great. Well, thank you very much, Steve, and thank you very much, Jeff, for the opportunity to be on this panel. Really appreciate it. Just wanted to, you can go to, I'm the Federal Affairs Manager at NESTE. Next slide, please. So just, we can skip to the next one too. This is just a standard slide. NESTE is a publicly traded company. We're a Finnish company, started in just after World War II, and have recently pivoted to renewable fuels about 15 years ago. But that previous slide, just don't invest in NESTE based on anything I say today. So I want to give you a little bit of background on NESTE before we get into the policy discussion and where we see the SAF scale-up trajectory going. So as I mentioned, NESTE got into renewable fuels about 15 years ago, and we're now the world's largest producer of renewable diesel, which is a very similar fuel to sustainable aviation fuel. Both are, middle distillate synthetic hydrocarbons, and that really contributes actually to the policy discussion that we'll be having. We, have to compete with renewable diesel, and so. Recently, NESTE has really shown a strong interest in SAF. We're really committed to this market, but right now, the world's largest producer of renewable diesel at about 1 million tons, excuse me, 1 billion gallons, several million tons. Right now, we have a capacity of 100,000 tons or 34 million gallons of SAF, and that the key word there is capacity. So we have the capability to produce that, but right now the production of SAF worldwide is substantially less than that, I would say, because of policy, and we'll get into that in a moment. But we are a producer of what's called HEFA, hydrotreated esters and fatty acids. That's one of the 7 pathways that Steve mentioned. We use traditional oily waste and residue feedstocks and a hydrotreating process and turn that into a synthetic hydrocarbon. We think that is the first step in the commercialization and scale up of SAF. It is commercially ready today, as Steve mentioned, and there's quite a bit of feedstock out there on HEFA, up to perhaps 10% of global jet fuel use when you start talking about things like cover crops and other oily feedstocks there. But so that's the first step. NESTE and our competitors that are in the market today are using HEFA. But we see, there are facilities under construction today, and the next step is really these MSW, lignocellulosics, and some of these other technologies that NESTE is also exploring and hoping to commercialize ourselves. And then beyond that, and there's enough feedstock there to exceed global jet fuel use, and there's been lots of studies there. So it's really not a feedstock question, but really a policy question. And then the next step, so you're hearing probably a lot about in the media, is so-called power to liquids, using renewable energy and captured CO2, and that has a technical potential that's unlimited. And you know, policy can also unleash that as well, and that would be the next step beyond the MSW and the lignocellulosics. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned, NESTE is commercially providing this fuel today since 2018. We were doing some demonstration flights as far back as 2011, but this product is available today. You can see all of our commercial agreements. Won't go through all of those, but most recently we've announced supply in the U.S. to American, Alaska, and JetBlue, and even more recent than this slide was created. Last week we announced we'd also be supplying fuel to Signature Aviation at San Francisco Airport as well. So again, this is a commercially available product. The issue is how much supply we can get, and whether this will be a niche product or whether this will be you know, really scaled, and we think that policy is really the key driver there. So next slide, please. So there are some policies today for sustainable aviation fuel. Of course, in the U.S., we have, you know, the federal renewable fuel standard. You have the California low carbon fuel standard, and you have, you know, other tax policies as well. But we think there, you know, additional SAF policies will be required, and the issues there are that even though we have you know, some helpful policies, we do not have parity with, at least in the United States, with ground transportation fuel. So to get towards competitiveness, really need to have equivalent policies or potentially, you know, policies favoring sustainable aviation fuel, because, you know, as Steve mentioned, there are some real benefits of SAF that you may not be seeing in the ground transportation markets, and also you have, you know, a lot less options in aviation, obviously. So there's, you know, the conventional emissions benefits, there's also non-CO2 benefits. So we think there's a strong case for SAF-specific policies, multipliers, carve-outs, or mandates. Really important to start that policy discussion, and there can be a lot of different policies that can you know, incentivize sustainable aviation fuel, and that can be workable. They could be mandates, could be tax incentives, which have really worked very well in the U.S. as Brentan mentioned. Grants, you know, carbon taxes. You know, that there's a lot of different policies, and Fred has done a great job in leading the way on exploring these policies, both through his work with the Canadian Biojet Supply Chain Initiative, and also through authoring a project with the Atlantic Council this year on SAF policies and what could be done. What's really critical is starting that conversation, elevating that conversation, and getting policymakers aware that SAF-specific policies will be required. There's a reason that we're seeing a lot of investment in renewable diesel and less investment in sustainable aviation fuel, and that's directly related to the policies that favor renewable diesel and ground transportation fuels more generally. So just touch on a few policies, conversations that are going on right now that involve SAF. We have the Canadian Clean Fuel Standard. You know, from a SAF perspective, we'd love to see an obligation for aviation eventually in phase one, as those discussions are ongoing. We think there should at least be an opt-in, and that a multiplier should be explored. In Europe, they have a multiplier for RED II, and that sort of recognizes the more nascent state of SAF versus ground transportation fuel. We're very excited about all the developments in the United States recently. A few years ago, there wasn't a lot of policy discussion on sustainable aviation fuel, really much more of a focus on R&D. But the CARES Act discussions around COVID had a you know, substantial provisions for SAF, you know, over $1 billion in grants and R&D money that were allocated in the Democratic draft and in the CARES discussions in March. And then in June and early July, the Moving Forward Act, also known as HR 2, had some pretty substantial SAF provisions, but really focused on, again, on that grant and R&D side of $100 million for 5 years for grants, with another $100 million for 5 years that were eligible for SAF, and then $30 million for 5 years for R&D. But what we think is really critical for SAF is a long-term demand driver, and that demand driver needs to be performance-based, technology, and feedstock neutral. So we're hoping that the U.S. Congress will move beyond grants and R&D and really look at that long-term policy driver. And we, NESTE, are involved in a coalition with many aviation stakeholders to look at tax policy as that potential demand driver. But again, there are many potential ways to do this. And then on the Senate side, and also on the House, again on the House, you had the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis really featured sustainable aviation fuel in their report out in the end of June, and endorsed Congress looking specifically at both a SAF tax credit and multipliers in the renewable fuel standard or a future low carbon fuel standard. And then we had the Democratic Special Committee on the Climate Crisis also examined SAF policy in their recent report in July, looking at a potential low carbon fuel standard. And then the European discussion is quite advanced as well, and we actually have a mandate today in Norway, and Sweden just announced last week that they would have a mandate starting next year. And then the European Union is having a consultation process ongoing for EU-wide policies, and lots of discussions going on in France and Spain and elsewhere. So we're really excited about the policy discussion going on in Europe, and hoping to continue that discussion in Canada and the United States as well. And I'll pause there.
Okay, thanks, Alex. That's a mouthful for sure. Finally, we'll transition over to Fred to share some views from Advanced Biofuels Canada and other efforts in which the Waterfall Group has been engaged. Alex mentioned a couple of those, but Fred, go ahead and give us an opening statement on some views with respect to Canada.
Great, thanks a lot, Steve. Good to be a participant on this panel. Thanks, Jeff and the Scaling Up team for the invitation. Pleased to be a sponsor. So I'm Fred Ghatala. I'm the Director of Carbon and Sustainability for Advanced Biofuels Canada. And on the next slide, Jake, you'll see our member profile. We're about 22 members, which have globally installed approximately 14 billion liters of advanced fuel that includes everything from conventional renewable fuels through to synthetic fuels using a range of feedstocks. So we're quite active across Canada at the provincial and federal level. There's a suite of policies that are in place ranging from fuel regulations like RFSs, LCFSs, to carbon tax programs, capital investment programs, of course, carbon pricing, and how fuel quality standards and sustainability standards are implemented in regulation and guide market behavior. On the next slide, you'll note that our membership is quite broad in terms of the technologies we use, the products our members use, and the co-products that are created. And if you hone in right at the center, you'll see Biojet and SAF. So it's one of many products. Certainly we have members that are providing technologies to produce those products for the aviation space, and also are actively developing projects. And moving forward, I'll give a quick overview of the current state of play of the Clean Fuel Standard. I'd call it a complex regulation that could take me more than the webinar to explain, but just the highlight hit points are, it's got a target that's driven from a Paris Agreement carbon budget approach of 30 million tons of incremental emission reductions. So that means that they are in addition to regulations in place in Canada at a certain point in time. The latest official release from the Government of Canada was a proposed regulatory approach, which was in June 2019. We're expecting draft regulations to be released this fall, so that's on or before December 21st. So what will come out first is the draft regulations for liquid fuels, which will then be followed 12 months by solid and gaseous fuels. So we're looking at a 2022 implementation date for liquid fuels, and then 12 months after for solid and gaseous. What we understand, and what was announced in previous consultations of June this year, it was confirmed that aviation will be considered during the solid gaseous fuels consultation, which is being referred to as phase 2. Alex mentioned phase 1 in his slide as being a target date for opt-in ability of low carbon aviation fuels. We understand that to be in place. or to be the direction that the draft regulations will describe and will be implemented in final regs for the liquid stream. The target carbon intensity is 12 grams per megajoule by 2030. So that would be on a essentially linear schedule, reaching to 2020. The CFS will use a new LCA model that's being developed. Currently, we do not have a clear line of sight on exactly what carbon intensity values will be for the different renewable fuel pathways. So in a carbon intensity driven regulation like the CFS, the market share of different fuel types will be determined by how they score on that metric. So that's a big to be determined. And the approach to indirect effects like indirect land use change will, to start with, take the same approach that the European delegated regulation takes, which is a risk-based approach. Some feedstocks will be in a high-risk category and will not be eligible for CFS credits. Here's where the CFS is slightly different than other clean fuel type regulations. It's got 3 different compliance categories. So category 1 is options that reduce greenhouse gases in the upstream oil and gas sector. Compliance category 2 is your traditional low carbon intensity fuels. Compliance category 3 is through in-use fuel switching. So we've got a bit of a mix of compliance categories. It seems that the reg borrows some approaches that the EU Fuel Quality Directive takes through allowing upstream emission reductions to count towards compliance. So the CFS is being increasingly described as a regulation that will incent innovation and adoption of clean tech in the oil and gas sector, as well as encourage the use of low carbon fuels and fuel switching technologies through all other aspects of liquid fuel use. So the industry, to put it, I mean, very mildly, is really waiting for what will be contained in Canada Gazette 1, because that will define really what the renewable fuel landscape will look like for the decades ahead. On the next slide, I'll drill right into what's been discussed and what has been considered during consultations with Environment and Climate Change Canada for aviation. The approach that the CFS takes is to put all refined petroleum products in a single stream, and then low carbon options reduce emissions relative to that stream and create compliance credits based on their difference with it. So to sum that up, every refined petroleum product would have the same type of carbon intensity reduction. So if aviation was included, as it has previously been proposed to be included as part of the petroleum stream, it would potentially have a 12 gram per CI reduction target, which, depending on the carbon intensity of the SAF, could be, I mean, anywhere from a 15 to 21% blend rate. So there is discussion on whether aviation has the same target CI reduction requirement as all of the basket of refined fossil fuels, or whether it has a differentiated target. So proposals have been put forward for a 1.5 gram reduction target by 2030. And the reason a differentiated target has been proposed is that it recognizes that aviation is at least a decade behind other on-land transportation sectors in terms of the penetration of renewable fuels. There's a lot more capacity that needs to be put in place before there's anything, I mean, even nearing the ability to put in, double-digit blend rates in Canada's aviation fuel pool. Another option that's been discussed is the use of multipliers. They are generally not widely supported because of the response that they can dilute the signal for renewable fuel blend rates. The multiplier proposal that has been discussed at the technical working group level has some nuance to it. For instance, limit it to only, say, 2% of the aviation fuel mix. So don't allow the multiplier, the use of it, to extend beyond the jet fuel compliance obligation, so that it's actually cannibalizing demand from other sectors. So there is a bit of nuance for how the multiplier has been approached, and it's expected because the aviation consultation will happen on the timeline as the solid and gaseous regs, that there'll be more time to go through and discuss what some of these different policies may be, or what some of the different approaches may be for aviation. So to sum it up, the clean fuel standard is potentially a very large signal for low carbon fuels in Canada's fuel supply. Aviation, it appears, will be a participant in it, but the exact terms of how it participates are to be decided in the lead up to the phase 2 regulations. So expect it to be an active number of months ahead as the aviation specific discussion is enjoined by multiple stakeholders. I'll leave it at that. Thanks. Steve, you are muted.
See that. Thank you. Thanks, Fred. So I started to comment that, yeah, these are all content-rich discussions, and part of that is it reflects the fact that we've been working in this realm for 15 years. We've got some great success examples of technology development, policy approaches to support that, and some other cases that are not so much. Alex, for instance, and we can perhaps get back to this in a few minutes, but Alex is involved with a group with the Advanced Biofuels Association who continues to work on fixing or making tweaks to existing policy that, when it was put in place 20, 15 years ago, didn't capture a full reflection of what was happening. And I think we'll see the same thing, or Fred just commented that we're seeing the same thing today with respect to Canadian regulators thinking about what actually makes the most sense. And we need to think about this holistically. Do we want one fuel to be prioritized over another because aviation doesn't have some fallback technology opportunities that other sectors have, et cetera? Anyway, I'm gonna ask one follow-up question of each of the panelists, and then we'll get to the questions that are coming in from the audience. First question goes to Brentan, and it's a couple parts. First, Brentan, do you believe that risk reduction alone is sufficient to see broad commercialization, particularly as we continue to see disparity between pricing in SAF versus conventional jet?
Yeah, I mean, in the absence of policy, I mean, it is not enough, right? I mean, at the end of the day, SAF has to compete economically with the conventional, and if you're going to do that without any policy support anywhere, it's probably not going to get to that point, right? But the policy support is instrumental in making these things bankable by providing, depending on the policy support structure, providing other revenue streams or CapEx reduction opportunities that enable it to compete on a dollar for dollar basis.
Okay. Do you have some rough order of magnitude numbers that you've seen, not in the SAF industry necessarily, but with respect to any renewable fuel production, of the kind of the level of CapEx reduction or basis points or something that can come along with the risk reduction kinds of products that you're talking about?
Yeah, well, I mean, we think of our businesses, it's not really, we don't think of it as CapEx reduction, we think of it as cost of capital reduction. So, if you're going to go out and try to finance a biofuels facility, depending on the risks inherent in that facility, technical risk, offtake risk, credit pricing risk, different capital markets are going to be available to you. And the point of the insurance is to enable access to lower cost of capital markets that you otherwise wouldn't be able to access. So you get a step change in your cost of capital. Interest rate reductions 200 basis points or more, and the insurance premium you pay for that is a fraction of the cost savings you get from the cost of capital reduction. So what we're really trying to do is help companies move from venture debt into larger scale private equity, or move from those private equity markets into institutional capital that will lend at infrastructure funds, that lend at lower rates. But going along with lower rates is they want lower risk, so you have to address that somehow.
Right. Do you find yourselves advocating for support for risk reduction through R&D activities, et cetera, from policymakers? Is that a normal part of the course of your activity too?
I mean, I'd say we stay up on the policy discussions. I mean, I think the point was made earlier, a lot of the discussions up to today at the policy level have been on the R&D side, grants. We can't go in and take a project that works in the on a beaker and sorry, bye. Have a good day at school. Good day. Daughter's off to school. We can't go in and take a project that works at the bench scale and scale that up to thousands of barrels a day, $hundreds of million capex. There has to be a pilot facility, a demonstration facility that's been built that proves out the technology to a level that we can underwrite against. And generally, those have been partially supported by government activities, grants, those types of things. So I don't say we're out in the world advocating for them, but we see them as necessary to enable technologies to move forward.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate it. And thanks for sharing your humanity with the rest of us. We're all in the same position. Alex or Fred, any comments with respect to what Brentan just said? No, you guys can shake your head. I can see you. Okay. All right, second question goes to Alex. And Alex, actually, thanks for highlighting the potential sort of technology transition wave. I made mention of that in my comments, but it's actually nice to see somebody put that down in a format that's easier to understand. So those are things we might expect to see with SAF production over the next couple of decades. NESTE is a leading producer of HEFA. At present, one of the lower cost, lower risk ways of producing SAF. But clearly, NESTE has been communicating about the need for additional pathways conducive to different feedstocks and locations around the world. And from an industry practitioner's perspective, I'm very encouraged by that approach of NESTE not putting all their eggs in one basket and recognizing some of the other opportunities that are out there. Alex, here's the question. Do NESTE and other ABFA producers still see the need for continued R&D with respect to some of those things? You see the opportunity for even continued reduction of carbon index from HEFA fuels, or the next round of fuel production technologies actually might lower the cost of production versus HEFA? And coupled with that, what supporting policy is really needed to enable widespread commercialization of more technologies and more feedstocks?
Sure. Thank you, Steve. And I think there's a continuing role for R&D, and we certainly encourage the U.S. Congress and other policymakers to continue to emphasize research and development. DOE and FAA and NASA and others have done a lot of great work on R&D. I think my message is that a long-term demand driver, 10 years or more, policy, whether that's a tax credit or some other type of policy, will really unleash a lot of investment and also ingenuity. So we see continuous improvement over time, but I think the amount of money that you're talking about, $30 million for 5 years, would probably pale in comparison to what you might see if those private capital markets that Brentan is talking about were engaged in the SAF space based upon a long-term policy certainty. So we see, again, HEFA being the place to start, but continuous improvement both within HEFA. You can use green hydrogen within the HEFA process, which is hydro treating. You also can lower the CI through your feedstocks with cover crops. You could have negative CI. I don't want to seed the ground for advanced negative CI fuels to other technologies with widespread deployment of cover crops, with soil carbon, negative indirect land use change values from that. You could have a very high performing HEFA fuel as well. So I guess I think that the key to unleashing, putting steel in the ground and also getting that R&D as well is the long-term policy drivers.
Yeah, agreed.
And I'll hop in with a couple of comments, just for the option to say something in response to Brentan's. And I think it's essentially that the renewable fuel space has more than enough policy risk. So anything that can be done to drive down technology risk would be, I mean, is so welcome in this space, especially to, move the dial on all of the technologies that were in the far right top histogram chart that Alex presented. So that would be my response to what Brentan shared. The role of R&D, absolutely. I think it'd be so hubristic to say that there's no R&D needed in this space. A comment I would have is that it's the scale of the R&D that focusing on small incremental improvements to processes is extremely important. And that's what we're seeing in the conventional biofuel space, that you're seeing incremental improvements that lead to incremental CI reductions. So it's not necessarily, stepping up to the plate and trying to hit a grand slam on R&D. It's just chipping away at your cost of production and your carbon intensity per unit of fuel. And so how that actually translates into the policy is, if you've got a policy that's performance-based, that's nimble, with recognizing carbon intensity reductions, then you really find a way that producers can recoup their investments in incremental CI reductions immediately or as soon as possible. So if you've got the ability to generate a new CI score, get that verified quite quickly, get that up on the board and monetize that, that's a direct line of sight for that investment. If you're in a bucket where if you're 65% better versus 51, well, it kind of does chop off some of that incentive to really invest in those incremental CI reductions. That's why I think rightly so, you see a lot of interest in the LCFS approach of policies, of course, with the surety and the security that you get through a volumetric blend mandate.
Yeah, thanks, Fred. I mean, that you hit the nail on the head in the U.S. with respect to our federal policy, which is a renewable fuel standard, and has that bucket approach and doesn't reward the actual results that you want to incent versus the LCFS, which does it in spades. And LCFS right now creates an opportunity where the producer can look forward to perhaps 2.5 cents per gallon policy benefit per unit of CI reduction, right? So it's a clear, very clear, direct influencer for continuing to lower the CI through optimization of the supply chain, through things like looking at renewable hydrogen, et cetera. So it's a strong incentive. Absolutely couldn't agree with you more on having a good targeted outcome-based metrics with respect to policy. Very good. The other issue that we face in the U.S. is a disparity between different kinds of fuel and between the different policies that exist in the U.S. right now. I made this comment last week. The last time I did this math, renewable diesel is worth to the producer about 51 cents a gallon more than it is for a sustainable aviation fuel. And so that creates this dichotomy. And that's something for policymakers to think about. And so, for instance, right now, over the next 6 years, we expect close to 4 billion gallons of renewable diesel production capacity to come online. That's just in the US. And the amount of sustainable aviation fuel production is a fraction of that because of that dichotomy in policy and some other things. It's not only a result of that, but that's a big driver, 50 cents a gallon. So, all right, thanks for that comment, Fred. Fred, we sort of teed you up with respect to some other work that you've been involved with respect to the policy options through the Atlantic Council, et cetera. Given the opportunity here, do you just have some advice for your Canadian colleagues and policymakers with respect to good targets, good things to be thinking about? We already mentioned the metric-driven approach. What else are you thinking about?
Thanks, Steve, for referencing the Atlantic Council work, and Alex also for it. It's a pretty dense document with a lot of recommendations that run through attracting capital, assisting with SAF facility operation, actually creating structural demand for it. I think I'd, right in my response, hone in on the structural demand for SAF as clearly the key enabler. There's obviously the causality paradox and the chicken and egg of you cannot mandate a fuel to be used that doesn't necessarily exist. But it clearly, with all of the renewable diesel capacity under construction and operational, certainly there is the ability to switch over and produce some of that into the jet fuel mix. The main issue is that jet fuel prices are down 50% from a year ago, probably more as of this morning. Aviation is 50% of what it was a year ago. If anyone still really thinks that what is going to unlock massive SAF capacity and use is price parity with jet fuel, and also the profitability of SAF facilities is absolutely integral to that, that's a very difficult proposition with jet fuel so low. It would appear that just a small on-ramp to a required inclusion rate of SAF into jet fuel is what will start more production capacity to find a market in the aviation space rather than renewable diesel. So I do think that it is classically, not pushing a rope, but providing some market pull to pull those molecules into the commercial aviation space.
Okay. Anybody else with a comment on that topic? All right, we'll go ahead and switch over to some questions from our participants. And I'll go ahead and handle the first one, and we'll bounce these around to different folks. First question is, will aircraft need new types of engines to use SAF? And this was prefaced by somebody who's a non-engineer and perhaps hasn't been working in the sector much. Do we need new engine types, and how much work is ongoing with companies like Boeing and Airbus on making them open to SAF? And how about regulator oversight? So I'll take this one. And I made the comment in my opening statement that what we're talking about, SAF, is jet fuel. And actually, when it's produced to the specification framework that we've created, it actually gets renamed as D1655 jet fuel. So to very specifically answer the question, there are no changes needed to engines and airplanes, airport fuel infrastructure, airport or fuel supply infrastructure generally, or any other location or any other aspect of the way that we know and love jet fuel today. It's completely drop in, no changes are required. And it's important to highlight that because that was a key foundational premise of the aviation industry actually committing to the goals that we've set for ourselves. And keep in mind, we set those goals for ourselves, the first industry to do that. Carbon neutral growth from 2020 and this long-term reduction goal. And it was that we didn't have to be burdened with the concept of having billions of dollars of capital also go into airport retrofits or fuel supply retrofits or tens of billions of dollars into aircraft retrofits. So these fuels are drop-in, and there are no issues with that. The FAA and several other certification authorities have oversight with respect to the process. Those authorities actually don't regulate the fuel. They simply regulate how the manufacturers certify their equipment to operate on that fuel. So they're not in the business of fuel certification. And several agencies, including the Europeans and the Americans, have put out guidance to let people know that that's the case. No, we're not certifying these fuels. We don't need to. As long as they meet the spec, the system has the safety, operability, et cetera, that it needs. So no changes, no oversight required. All of the engagement is in the process of qualifying the fuel production pathway in the first place. It's a couple-year process, several $1 million worth of effort. All of the major OEMs are involved in that. And what happens, what has happened when a fuel gets added to the specification is all of this groundwork has been done to assure everybody in the industry, including all of the OEMs, that the characteristics of the sustainable fuel production actually meet the requirements of being a drop-in fuel. So that's how we're handling that. All right, next question. And I can toss this around. You all have different perspectives likely. What do airlines think of SAF right now and in the near future? Given the dramatic decline in demand for air travel, questions about if, when it recovers, and concerns over revenue, survival of airlines, is higher cost SAF a priority right now? So I'll give you my opinion. Alex actually sells fuel, and my opinion is going to be a direct reflection of something that he already said. So absolutely, airlines are concerned about near-term survival. Airlines are also concerned about long-term survival, and this is part of this of what drove the sustainability strategy in the first place. That we recognize as an industry, we need to continue to become more sustainable, just like any other industry. So in the same breath that an airline is concerned about survivability tomorrow, they're also concerned about survivability in 5 years and in 30 years. So yes, they are still paying attention. The airlines haven't laid off all the people working in their sustainability functions. In the last 3 weeks, I think there have at least been 3 major announcements with respect to an airline committing to new fuel acquisition, new SAF acquisition, working with NESTE and others to actually bring fuel into an airport. On the business aviation side, that's also occurring. We had another airline commit just this week to certain fractions of SAF in certain timeframes. So from my perspective, yes, getting through COVID is a very near-term priority, but the longer-term priority hasn't changed. Alex, Brentan, Fred, you want to comment on that?
Sure, I'll take a stab at that. So I think, that's exactly right, Steve. I think, the airlines, recognize that SAF is going to be critical to meeting their long-term climate goals. The 50%, the industry goal of a 50% reduction with a 2005 baseline, and more recently, you're seeing things just announced last week with One World Alliance, net zero by 2050. So if you look, anybody that's paying attention, if you look at the ICAO charts as to how those goals are going to be met, or the industry charts, SAF is a huge part of that. You can make a lot of progress with new equipment and operational improvements and market-based measures and things like that. But sustainable aviation fuel is viewed as probably the largest contributor to aviation decarbonization. So taking that long-term view, I think the airlines are very committed, and we're very excited about a lot of the recent announcements. I think that they are also aware of the need for policy in this space. And so we're really excited to be working with our airline partners on additional policies. And I think it was touched on earlier that people just weren't thinking about sustainable aviation fuel in 2005 or 2007 when Congress enacted the RFS. So I just need to do a lot more education and put this on the plate of policymakers. And I think there's a lot of interest in solving this policy problem. And what Steve alluded to is absolutely correct. You have at least 50 cents, perhaps more, of opportunity costs of policy disincentive for sustainable aviation fuel versus renewable diesel. And that's, because both they weren't thinking about it, but also the states in the US don't feel necessarily empowered to do much on sustainable aviation fuel because of the federal role on aviation. So we see the federal government as having a real opportunity here to make up for that incentive gap with renewable diesel. And we're really excited to be working with our airline partners on things like tax incentives or other long-term policies for sustainable aviation fuel.
Yeah, and I would add to that. I mean, when we were working on projects recently, I mean, the inclusion of an airline either as an off-taker or as an equity provider, and we are seeing airlines as stepping up to the plate to actually provide equity for a lot of these next generation biofuels projects. That is a very large market signal to the lending community that there's a big, usually creditworthy entity that's standing there that's going to put their weight behind a project, whether it's passenger side or folks like FedEx on the package side of things. One area we've seen airlines start to sort of tiptoe into that I think if they kept going down that route would make a really material impact is not just providing offtakes to projects, but also taking on the credit risk. And by credit risk, I mean the price of the actual credits, the renewable credits. So in the LCFS market, in the biofuel space, in the biogas space, a lot of the movement in that space has been driven by big oil companies who do the offtakes, and they take the credit risk. They say we'll pay you X dollars for this thing, and the LCFS price, we're going to monetize that. So we're going to take the risk that goes up or down. And that's really enabled the marketplace because it provides a home for that risk. And I think, we've seen some airlines start to step up to that plate in sort of small levels, but if they continue down that path and say, we're not only going to buy the fuel, we're going to take the pricing risk on that credit, I think that would be materially impactful to enabling SAF to move forward.
And I'll chime in last that in Canada, the airlines are extremely active and interested in SAF. The major airlines and the association, the National Airlines Council of Canada, they're all participating in the consultations on the Clean Fuel Standard. And what is really at the top of the list is wanting to use SAF, but wanting to use SAF that's produced in Canada. So if the Clean Fuel Standard is setting up the potential for large investments in capacity expansion for renewable fuels in Canada, SAF should be part of that so that domestically produced sustainable fuels can be used by Canadian airlines. But it's not just SAF and necessarily the Clean Fuel Standard. There's a lot of other policies that the airlines are engaged on. I mean, right now, SAF blended in Canada would be required to pay the federal carbon charge, would be required to pay the British Columbia carbon charge. So there's some aspects that can be improved where if you have a low carbon renewable fuel, it likely should not be taxed as if it was a high carbon fossil fuel. So all of those things combined means that there's multiple policies at play. The airlines are, I think, as engaged as ever with SAF. Steve, you pointed it out rightly. There are survival concerns, and that's certainly job number one. But build back better seems to be quite the mantra when it comes to COVID relief response. So I think SAF and carbon policy in general is really baked in and part of that.
Okay. Next question, I think, is a quick one. What's the current level of SAF use by military in the US and Canada and elsewhere as part of their regular fuel purchases and use, and how can it be increased? I'll address it from the US perspective. The use the last several years has been zero because of the approach that the Defense Logistics Agency uses to purchase fuel. It's based on price. And so the only way that SAF could win a contract with the US military is if it came in at a lower price than conventional, which is unlikely, or if it exactly matched, and then perhaps it would get pulled across the goal line because it's a renewable product. Any observations from Canada?
Yeah, the federal government is consulting on the federal procurement of SAF and also renewable marine fuels. So we know that that's something that's being actively looked at. I mean, the Great Green Fleet was such a key part of building out renewable diesel and SAF capacity in the US. I mean, Chris Tyndall at CAAFI had a direct role in that. So that's certainly getting bankable federal demand is a key part of it. I mean, the Green Fleet Initiative was quite a large volume that was purchased, so instrumental in standing up facilities, and you could see clearly that's an opportunity to be translated into Canada.
All right, we're down to a minute, and unfortunately 4 or 5 questions just came in, so we're not going to get to those. And Jeff, I'll leave it up to you if you want to pass these on and we can respond to them directly or through some other means. I think these next several questions are all going to go into too much detail. There's questions about book and claim, which is another important facet to get around certain roadblocks in with respect to users who may be less price sensitive than others.
Steve, if there's any last minute comments, that people want to make, we can go 1 or 2 minutes over, but otherwise.
Yeah, so I'll stop there with the questions. We'll figure out how to address those. I don't have any additional comments to make. I appreciate it. I think you got a sense for the breadth of what's actually happening in this space. There's a lot happening, a lot to look forward to. Additional R&D and commercialization assistance is warranted, but it's not a matter of it stopping production today. We're simply looking into the future to a next set of pathways and feedstocks to make production more robust. So we're ready to go today. Several facilities in production, several in development. Things look bright on that perspective. People are looking at from all corners on how to improve the overall value proposition. Alex, any last comments from you?
No, just to build off the military discussion, I did see in the Q&A that there was a discussion of military role in procurement in the future potentially, and that's of course another area we could look at, and Fred explored that, I think, in some of his reports. And the military has done a great job for the SAF industry in certification, and that is an area of federal policy, but right now, as you mentioned, is not an area with a lot of activity, but it certainly could be another lever to pull in the future.
Yeah, and I know that there are currently some U.S. congresspersons who are looking at that kind of approach, that how military use can be an instigator. Fred?
Only final comments is that please feel free to reach out via email if you have specific questions, and it's been great to be here with all of you. I think if this was occurring last year, a quarter of us would have probably literally been on airplanes right now. So good to have everyone together in this space.
Thanks, Fred. Brentan, I'll give you the last word.
All right, lucky me. I guess my only comment would be, for the folks out there who are really involved in the policy, putting it together, from the bankability side, the key aspect is durability. Knowing that policies put in place are going to be long-term and can be relied upon, making sure those policies are put in place so that they're not subject to legal wranglings and things that could inject uncertainty in the marketplace. That's key to make sure the financing markets will pick up and stand behind them.
Yeah, absolutely. Uncertainty is a bane for our industry. So thanks for everybody's contribution. And Jeff, I'll pass it back to you, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. And just following up on what you said, Brentan, yes, everybody knows the phrase necessity is the mother of invention, but certainty is the mother of investment. So thanks for your comments all. Sadly, that's all the time we have for today. It's been a wonderful panel. Thanks, Steve, for leading this discussion and managing all those great questions. If you want to connect with any of today's speakers, you're going to see my email address there, so you can send me an email and I can do an e-intro to any of today's speakers. Brendan, it was lovely to see your daughter jump in there for a minute. What a lovely looking little girl. I don't know why you spend all that time with us when you have such a wonderful daughter, but thanks for your time. And a big thank you to our platinum sponsor, EcoStrat, and a big thank you today to CAAFI and to Advanced Biofuels Canada for hosting today's session. Thanks to our panelists, thanks to our audience, thanks to the technical team of Jake and Eva. And please remember that next week's webinar, The Role of the Industrial Bioeconomy in Addressing Climate Change, will be September 29th, and it's hosted by Iogen Corporation. This is Jeff Passmore signing off. See you next week. Bye for now.